Welcome to this episode of Paddle and Flow. Nicola and I are back, and today we're going to be talking about wind and waves and how you read a forecast and what that means for our paddling. We hope you enjoyed the last episode where we talked about setting up our kayaks, and we were chatting before we went on air that there are things in there that we probably could have said or missed, so we might do another episode on that a little later down the line if people are enjoying the podcast. Nicola, welcome. How are you?
Good morning. Hello. Afternoon, evening, whatever. Hello. How am I? I'm fine, thank you. Well, mostly fine.
Mostly fine.
Yes.
Frozen shoulder still playing up?
Frozen shoulder is more frozen than I thought it was. Yes, I thought it had unfrozen, but it hasn't.
It's the weather.
Yes.
And I've fallen down the stairs and potentially have a fracture in my back. So between us, we're not really getting out on the water, are we?
No, not doing as well as we could be.
And we talk about forecasting and wind and waves today. And yet, you were talking to me earlier about how yesterday perhaps you should have gone paddling, but the day before when we were thinking about going, the wind was too strong. So just the way it goes, isn't it?
Hugely weather dependent.
Yeah.
With sea paddling. I think in a way that it's not so much with rivers, whitewater.
And because you came from whitewater rivers to sea, how do you find the difference? What are the biggest differences?
Salty, not salty. Is the first one. Well, in terms of weather, very. Well, that's the obvious one, Alex.
Salty and not salty.
I miss fresh water hugely. In terms of wind and weather, well, you kind of want it to rain or to be not. There's an optimum amount of rain when you're paddling on rivers. You don't want it to be too rainy because then you can, it's too frightening, too scary, too dangerous. But if it's too low, then, it's a scrape. You might not be able to get down the river. Whereas on the sea, and on a river, it doesn't really matter if it's windy. If you've got a little stretch where you're paddling into a headwind, okay, you just grit your teeth, get on with it. But on the sea, it's quite different.
Yeah, and I think, thinking back to the days when I used to river paddle, the area by me always had water. It didn't really scrape too much.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, for beginners, the summer was great because the weather, the lack of rain meant that the river was quite flat. It was relatively calm. You could get a nice paddle. But in the winter, when the rains go in, or in those changeable seasons, the river became quite fast and at some points quite dangerous. And there have been stories in the press as recently as last year with people who have unfortunately died or come to serious harm, paddling on that river without being prepared. Whereas in the sea, as you say, the rain actually, apart from the fact that we get wet, which neither of us particularly like, for us, it doesn't make much of a difference. But for the wind can have a really big impact on how our day's going to go.
I think for me, paddling on the sea, the wind is the deciding factor. I mean, obviously, I look at swell and waves as well, but swell and waves can be of take Sunday for example. The sea was pretty flat. Was it about a foot? I think.
Not even that. I don't think. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe swell was 0. Waves were a foot. Wind-blown waves. But the wind was too strong. Yeah. So for me, wind is the biggest factor, I think.
So you touched on a few things there that we want to get onto. So you talked there about sort of swell. You talked about the wind waves, the wind-blown waves, and wind strength. So we'll start with wind strength. It's probably the easiest place to start. When you're looking at a forecast, what are you looking at when you're thinking about the wind?
I have thresholds depending on wind direction. So I'm looking at, I have to apologise first of all because sea paddlers generally talk in knots. I don't, so I'm on miles an hour. So for me, if it's a westerly, which is our prevailing wind is supposed to be westerly,
yeah.
Although we've had an awful lot of easterlies in the last 2 years, I would say.
Yeah, I think so.
So my cut-off for a westerly, which is generally off, kind of cross off shore, will be about 22 miles an hour, maybe 23, 24. Anything above that is going to be a bit of a slog.
Yeah, you're right. The westerly is the prevailing wind here. And for us on the east coast of Scotland, where we are on the sort of the knuckle of the southeast, as I like to think of where we are, the westerlies tend to cause a crosswind, sometimes blowing a little bit offshore, but and that's obviously the direction. When we talk about wind, we're talking about the direction that the wind is coming from. So the westerly blows from the west to the east. Always good to clarify that, because that I find really confusing when I first started paddling, or reading forecasts in general.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, for me, I probably don't actually know what speed I go out in a westerly. I look at the sea and take a rough guess.
Right.
I'm quite bad with westerlies because the sea is often much flatter on a westerly,
Yeah.
because the wind is blowing across the land. It's not touched the water yet, so the wind, the waves haven't picked up. The wind hasn't sort of done anything. Here, the last 2 years, speaking to the fishermen in the harbour, I was chatting to Barry yesterday. Barry has a YouTube channel called One Man on His Boat. Quickly get a promotion in there for him. But I was chatting to Barry yesterday, and he was saying that he reckons there's been more easterlies in the last 2 years than there have been in the 10 years previous.
Wow.
Storm Arwen was a big easterly, Babette, and a couple of the others over the last few years. And we'll come on to those storms in a bit. But the easterlies for me, my limit is about 10 miles an hour, about 10 or 11 knots. I don't go out much more than that on an easterly, unless I'm with other people, because I paddle a lot and fish a lot by myself.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, the reasons are probably slightly different. So what about you for an easterly?
About 20, 21. But actually, that took a long time to get to that point. And I would probably bring that down, having recently gone out on an easterly of that speed and thought, this is stupid.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to get around the back of our harbour, where you're going out into open sea, and it's...
Was that the day that you and I paddled? Was that the day you and I recorded the first kind of chat for this podcast?
No, I don't. It was a day when it was okay. It comes, for me, a lot of it is I'm still learning what you see on paper or on a screen when it comes to a forecast, how that looks here on the sea. And sometimes what I expect it to look like, it doesn't. So for example, that day, I think it was maybe gusting 19 from the east. So it should have been okay. But got round the corner, it's quite exposed. You've got the full force of the easterly hitting you, and I actually turned around. It's the first time I've actually turned around and thought, no, I'm not doing that. This is stupid.
And for me, because I'm fishing, I have to take into account how fast my drifts are going, but also, what the conditions are to just sit still. Obviously, when you've got paddle in the water, when your blade's in the water, it's a lot more comfortable to be in rougher stuff because you're in control of the boat. You're driving through the wave in an appropriate time. But when we're fishing, when I'm sitting fishing, just sitting still, if it's too bumpy or the wind's going too fast, then I end up putting all this effort paddling, get my rods out, drop my rod in the water, and before you know it, I've already drifted back. So that's maybe where my wind limit comes from a little bit. When I'll paddle in much heavier conditions when I'm by myself. When I'm with other people than when I'm by myself.
It's very different, actually. I hadn't thought about that before. When you said 10 miles an hour, I was thinking, oh, is that all? But actually, if you want to sit still and fish, you're not going to do that in a 20-mile-an-hour wind.
No.
It's not going to be fun at all.
I've been out gusting 15, and I'll go at 10, 15 miles an hour. That's okay. But as soon as we get too fast and the drift is not conducive to fishing, then at that point I tend to not go out unless I'm paddling with other people or going for a social paddle with yourself or Russell. Then it's a bit different. But if I'm going out to fish or to record a YouTube video, then there's no point for me.
Yeah.
Why are we more comfortable going out when the wind's faster from the west than it is from the east? What's the reason?
For me, it's partial. Well, there's the obvious thing of from the west, it's flattening the sea. It's coming from land, like you said, and it's flattening the sea. And really, being offshore, it should be more scary. People say don't go out in an offshore wind, but as long as it's not too fast offshore, then I think you're fine. But when it's coming, psychologically for me, when it's coming from the east, it's coming from a huge expanse of water, and it builds the sea.
And I totally agree with you. You sit and we watch an easterly blow in, and you can see the sea changing height. You can see the waves beginning to grow, the white horses develop, and we start, you look out on an easterly and it can be blowing 20 knots, and it's 2, 3, 4 foot waves. You can go out on a westerly and it's almost glass.
Yeah.
You know?
I've actually had that happen. So the day I paddled out to see that tanker that was moored off about, it was about a mile and a half off Dunbar, on the paddle back, the wind started to pick up from the east. So the sea went from being glass to wavy and
Wavy.
not glass. Yeah, so it was interesting to watch.
Yeah. And you and I went for that paddle that we're going to cut in clips of here, probably, of me in your Virgo in the Lobster, and I'm trying to surf that wave. Well, not surf that wave. I'm being picked up by that wave, by the swell.
Yeah.
And realistically, again, that was an easterly swell.
Yeah.
Because we were paddling in the coves, in the sheltered area, no bother at all. And as soon as we went out into the slightly deeper water, that rolling swell kind of started to pick us up. And those waves were really steep.
They were, and close together.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No. Yeah, that's exactly where we're going.
Yeah.
Got a nice segue into wave height and period. So what is a wave period?
The distance or the time between two waves.
And I
peak to peak.
Didn't actually know that until I looked it up for this episode.
Did you not?
No, I didn't actually know I knew that the shorter it was, the worse it was, but I didn't actually understand how it all worked until I looked it up for this episode.
Right. Interesting. I only learned about it. It was something I completely ignored for a long time. I would look at the wave height and the swell height, but I didn't look at period until one day when I went out, and on paper, again, it was fine. But the wave period, I think around here, wave periods tend to be upwards of, I would say around 10 seconds, maybe 12 seconds. It's unusual, at least it was unusual, to get a short wave period. But this day it was 5 seconds. I hadn't checked that. So when I set off from shore, it was lumpy, but the tide was in, so the waves weren't breaking, and there wasn't a breath of wind, but the waves were really close together and really steep. Was the most scared I've ever been.
Because you were
paddling from here, because there was no. It was relentless. I don't know how. We always overestimate and state how big waves are, but these waves were above my head. So that's big, and that's too big for me.
Yeah, definitely.
By myself, going around the outside of the harbour. I had to I just took a line for the Isle of May, and I thought at some point I'm going to have to turn across these. Taking that line to the Isle of May, I was going into them, so I was fine. At some point I'm going to have to go across, which I did, and the thing is, it was absolutely fine, but I was scared.
So when you're paddling in big swell, then you talked there about how you went for a line of Isle of May and then you cut across. What are you thinking as you're sort of heading into the waves? So the boat's kind of cutting into the waves, so the wave's not tipping the side of the boat, because obviously our stability going forwards, that using the length of the boat is much better than if the side stability is not nearly as strong as the length stability, so bow to stern. So you're going bow to stern through the big waves, and then you had to make that turn. And how did you do that? What were you thinking?
Oh, I could tell you lots of things I was thinking. I actually wrote about it, and I was thinking, am I going to have to use my PLB today? And thinking how ridiculous that was, half a mile from shore. I was, I was thinking, I'm committed. I have to do this. I have to get through this section of water. I have to turn, otherwise,
Can't paddle all the way to the Isle of May.
No, because I'd have to come all the way back.
So when you turned, did you turn so that you were coming sort of across the waves, or did you come sort of more diagonally into them?
No, I was coming. They were coming from the side. Yeah, fully side on.
That'd be pretty scary.
I don't think I had a wobble.
Okay,
actually.
Good.
Maybe I've only ever had 2 little wobbles in that boat, and that I might have had one on that day. I was basically, I was scanning the horizon, scanning the waves constantly, paddling along and just watching for them and talking to myself. Talk to myself a lot. I'm
and were you in lobster or were you in
lobster?
Pink. You were in lobster.
I don't think I had pinks at that time.
Didn't have pinks at that time.
Yeah.
So you came across round the harbour.
Sorry, I can feel my heart rate increasing just thinking about it. Oh!
You came round the harbour, and then did you tuck in to the sort of harbour side of Dunbar? And then did they ease at that point?
Well, I turned and paddled across the waves to begin with, and I started to turn to come in. I think it was to the left of Scart Rock.
Castlefoot Rock?
Probably, yes, probably to the left of Castlefoot. But now, having seen that area at low tide, knowing that there's something under there, that explains why the waves there were worse.
Mm.
They were steeper. And so I aborted that and turned again to go back across and to come in further along, probably to the far side of Scart, or between the two, between Castlefoot and Scart Rock. And then, yeah, they just smoothed out into nothingness, and that sense of relief, I've done
Yeah.
it. But that is the longest 1 mile ever.
It's interesting that you say all that. I think for those listening to the podcast, if you're listening to this on a streaming service, I think we'll put a clip up on our YouTube channel, Paddle and Flow, of some of the footage of just some of the areas that you're talking about. Because unfortunately, you don't carry a camera when you're paddling, so we don't have any footage of the event. But we can talk about, you can show, what you mean by the sort of the rocks that we're talking about. And then you're right in between Castlefoot Rock and the harbour wall, so Johnson's Hole, kind of the edge of the harbour, the wall, there is that big boulder that we found on that low
Yeah.
tide paddle.
Yeah.
So that will have been sort of causing a huge cornucopia of waves.
I think at one point, when I was paddling with the waves coming behind me, I told myself to stop looking behind me. Stop looking back. Just go. The inevitability of the waves coming, it's just going to happen. So don't look behind you.
It's interesting because that's very similar to the day that I got really caught out and I gave myself a proper big fright. And actually, I do have some clips of that. So maybe if we're on the YouTube, I'll maybe chuck those in. Russell and I went paddling at White Sands, and it was not a breath of wind. We went out, and the swell was pretty big, but White Sands is a really protected bay. This was maybe only a year into my paddling, and I just moved to Dunbar, so I didn't understand how the waves were affected at White Sands. So White Sands is a bay not far from here. There's a big lighthouse, the Barnes Nest Lighthouse, and there's just two big reefs that come out, and there's a sheltered section in the middle. So when we looked out, there was a little bit of waves breaking on the reef, but it wasn't that bad. And the bay was lovely, gorgeous, flat. As soon as we breached beyond the bay, there's actually two really big shelves, or shelves, I suppose. And the waves come along, the swell comes along, it hits the shelf, and it's forced upward. So you get these really big rollers. And we went out and we hit the shelf, and yeah, sure enough, massive rollers. But what we didn't realize in talking about forecasting, why it's important not just to look at your direct forecast, is that there was a snowstorm coming in from Anstruther, and the snowstorm was being blown onto us, which, well, I just say blown up above, not blown at our level because we had no wind. And we ended up getting caught a mile offshore in a massive snowstorm. By the time we got in, we were both cold. The tide had risen, so the swell was no longer being protected by the reef. The bay was no longer being protected by the reef. The swell was now smashing into the bay. So we had to paddle in through swell, which was okay, but then we had to land on the beach in a 2-meter surf. And I was fairly new at this point. I'd been paddling a year. Russell had only been, I think it was Russell's second trip out in a kayak with me. So we both were pretty cold by the end of the paddle. It just shows that it's really important to understand, your wave forecast in your area.
It's interesting because somebody left a comment on one of my posts on Facebook. Don't you know everything? Don't you know everything that there is to know by now? And I just, nope. No, not when it comes to the sea.
Yeah.
So I've got so much to learn.
We're always learning, aren't we? I think,
Definitely.
And it's really important to take those experiences and learn from them
Yeah.
But also why we chat about it, because other people can learn from our mistakes as much as we can learn from our mistakes.
Don't do what I did. Check the wave period.
Check the wave period. And think about how the reef structure in your area will affect waves as well.
Tide height's important too. That day that I went out, it was high tide, which launching from East Beach in a high tide when there's any kind of swell is not pleasant because the waves are dumpy. But actually, it was good that it was high tide because there was enough water to stop them from breaking.
Yeah. Although bad because you'd have seen them breaking and you wouldn't have gone.
Exactly. What I used to, every time I went paddling on the sea, I'd also go down. I'd always go down to look at the sea before launching. Just wander down, have a look, check it out. And I'm lucky that I can do that. with a few years of experience now, I don't do that as often.
Mm. Very lucky that we live by the sea, so we
Mhm.
can do that and have a look. But there's definitely been times where I've gone and bailed that I wouldn't have done before because my travel distance was so long before I moved to Dunbar.
Yeah, that's
I would just go
interesting.
out because I traveled that far and I was traveling, so I'm going to go.
Yeah.
Whereas actually now I look at the sea sometimes, I get there and I go, do you know what, today's maybe not the day, and
Yeah.
actually pack up and go, which I think my risk tolerance has probably changed as well. So
Yeah.
I don't go out in as risky conditions because I'm not traveling. I'm not feeling the urge to go out because it's so much more accessible.
Mhm. Yeah. We're lucky here in Dunbar that we've got the knuckle, because on a westerly you can launch at East Beach and be relatively protected, and on an easterly you get a bit of shelter if you launch at the harbour and go that direction. What process do you use to decide whether to go paddling? Like, what apps are you using, or what forecasts?
What process and apps and forecasts do I use? That's a really good question. So I think for me, the first thing I do is think about how fit I'm feeling and how much food I've had that day, because I'll often go out at really short notice, provided I think I'm going to be able to do the paddle. I'll look at, I suppose my plan starts normally 2 or 3 days before. Certainly when I was, when I was living not by the sea, I used to sort of only look sort of the day if the weather was good, or a couple of days before. Whereas now, because I live by the sea and I'm looking at the forecast all of the time, because my life now revolves around being on the water,
Mhm.
I look at the forecast every single day. So I'm always keeping an eye on what's going on. But I'd recommend, if you're not someone that looks at the forecast every day, to start, if you're paddling on a Saturday, a weekend paddle, then start looking at the forecast on the Thursday or even the Wednesday, because that will tell you what the sea is doing by the Saturday. So I start looking at Windy, the app. So the blue one, because there's two apps called Windy.
There are.
So I use Windy, the blue app, and then Windy app, which is its name, is the red one.
Yes.
I have both.
Right.
And I look at both. I find that Windy is good for me because I can set up the custom sort of page to show me swell height, swell period, tide heights, moon phases. I can have everything on there. So I like having all that data to tell me what's going on. And I don't use the standard forecast on it.
Blue one you're
The
talking
blue
about.
one.
Right, because I've been told that the blue one isn't to be trusted. It's the red one.
Well, yeah. And I use the red one as well.
And do you find a difference between the two then?
Sometimes, but sometimes not, if I'm
Right.
honest.
That's interesting.
But then again, I think it depends on because you can set your own forecast.
Mhm.
It depends on which forecast you're using. And unfortunately, I didn't prepare that, so I can't remember which one I actually use. Because there's GFS Plus
Oh, there
and
are
there's
lots.
EMCW.
Yeah.
So I think I use GFS Plus.
Right.
So maybe I don't know. You could be right. You could be wrong. I have no idea. I like Windy. They also give me a pro subscription. I should probably clarify that, for free. Not because I'm sponsored, but because of my work in the emergency services, I get a pro subscription for free.
All right.
So there's Windy app, there's Windy. I look at those two. I also tend to check the shipping forecast, the inshore waters forecast.
Mhm.
Just have a look at that. And I tend to use some sort of tidal app as well, but I just look at tides, just any tides. But Windy, see, this is why I use the Windy, the blue Windy, is because it gives me tide height, it gives me everything I need. But I often cross-check it.
Right.
You use the Waveboy at Torness quite a lot, don't you?
I do. I use it. Yeah.
And do they forecast on that, or does that just tell you what's going on now?
No, they forecast few days, and it's every hour. They have a reading for every hour, and lots of information on there that I don't understand. And that's CFAS, so that's a government, the Centre for Environment, Fisheries, and blah, 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 blah. WaveNet, CFAS, if anybody wants to Google that. And they've got buoys all around the country. So that's 4.5 miles from us. So it's obviously farther out. On an easterly, the waves are going to be bigger here by the time they get here than they will be there.
Yeah.
But I just find it really, it's a good guideline.
Good
Just
guideline.
as a,
I sometimes think about wind over tide. Do you ever think about wind over tide, or do you not? Because that's not something that ever bothers you too much.
I don't really think about it. I can't say I've really ever noticed it here.
So I've not noticed too much here, But out in the channel between the Bass Rock and Seacliff, or between Craigleith Island and North Berwick, there's a deep gully there that a current runs through. That current can pick up to about 4 or 5 knots on a spring tide.
Yeah.
If you have a spring tide, so the largest difference between low and high, and we've got wind over tide, I find that it can get really, really choppy.
Yeah.
Just short, small period, not normally that big waves, 1 or 2 feet wave height, but really just choppy and unpleasant. The sort of wave that is going to tip you out of your kayak. If you get it side on and you lift the edge of the boat, it's going to get underneath you and it's just going to flip you. That sort of a wave.
The kind of waves that are there 1 minute and not the next. So you're paddling into fresh air.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the problem with fishing is that you're not paddling. So if you're sitting in that and you're trying to drift and fish, it's all over the place. You've not got your blade in the water. You can't feel what's going on. There's no way to brace if you were going to get thrown out your kayak. You've only got a fishing rod in your hand. I have my paddle sitting underneath my PFD on my hips so that if anything does ever happen, it's right there and I can just grab it. But at the same time, in those sorts of conditions, I'm never going to put my paddle away.
No.
But that's probably, for me, when I need to think about it, because of depending on where I'm fishing, which is one of the reasons why this year I've barely paddled anywhere other than Dunbar, because the conditions just haven't really been suitable, and I've stuck here because we've had so many easterlies.
I also use, I used to use Magic Seaweed, which was fantastic. I don't know if you ever used that, but that had all the information that you needed in one place. And then that was taken over by Surfline, which is not as good, and I think quite a few people agree. But I still check Surfline just as a backup. My go-tos are the same as you. I use Red Windy, Shipping, and Inshore Water Forecast. The Wave Boy is one of my major ones. And then also, I'll just double check against Windfinder, Surfline. I use Apple Weather for wind, Met Office. I have, my list is huge. XC Weather. And in the summer...
I like XC Weather. Sorry, in the summer.
Yeah, in the summer, I've been trying to learn a bit about thunderstorm forecasting, because very often we'll get perfect sea, perfect wind conditions, and then you wake up in the morning, like you've had your eye on a day for days, wake up in the morning, thunderstorm warning. And there have been a lot of those the last few years. Yeah. So I've been learning about thunder. So I use Windy's thunderstorm layer.
Oh yes, yeah, I know what you mean.
Sometimes fog as well. Windy for fog.
Fog. We've not even touched on fog in this episode.
I don't like fog.
Fog banks. I won't paddle in fog, actually. I take the boat out in fog, but I will not paddle in fog because I'm just too little.
I'm too scared.
Yeah.
I have paddled in fog with a friend before, but I'd rather not.
I mean, I'll paddle in light mist, but actually thick sort of fog banks where you go into them and you can't see more than 5 meters in front of your face. You can't see the end of the boat. That's too much fog for me. I
don't like fog on land, so I know I'm not going to like it on water.
Yeah. We haven't even touched on fog. We'll maybe do another episode on how fog forms, because I think we're probably getting to the end of this episode. So maybe we need to make this maybe end up being a 2-parter where we talk about fog as well.
And thunder.
Yeah. Well, let's do that. We'll end it here, and then we'll come back, and because I can go and cough. We'll end it here, and we'll come back and we'll talk about fog and thunder, because I think you've touched on something that we didn't prepare for, and that's really interesting. So we'll come back and talk about those in just a minute. If you've enjoyed this episode, please give it a like and subscribe. Follow us on the platform, whatever audio hosting site you use. You will probably find us on there. We're certainly going to be on Apple, Spotify, and a couple of the other sort of big podcast sites. If you are watching us on YouTube, please give us a like and subscribe, comment, and let us know what you want to hear us talk about. And as always, thank you very much for watching.
Yes, thank you.